The darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars, just the suffocating blackness of the Pacific jungle pressing down on every Marine huddled in their foxhole. And then they heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound. The jungle had gone silent. No insects, no birds, nothing. That's when they knew. The Japanese were coming. Night raids, banzai charges under cover of darkness. Infiltration attacks that turned the jungle into a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. Marines feared them more than artillery, more than aerial bombardment, more than anything else in the Pacific War. Because when the Japanese came at night, all your training meant nothing. All your firepower meant nothing. You couldn't see them, couldn't hear them, couldn't stop them until it was too late. And some Marines never slept again. Let me tell you why. Guadalcanal, August 1942, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. Marines had taken the airfield. They thought the hard part was over. They dug their foxholes, set up their perimeter, waited for dawn. But the Japanese had other plans. They'd been watching, learning the Marine positions, counting the machine gun nests, mapping every weakness in the American line. And when night fell, they moved. No flashlights, no cigarettes, no talking. Japanese soldiers had trained for months in night operations. They could navigate by starlight, by touch, by instinct. They removed their boots, wrapped their rifles in cloth to prevent metal from clanking, blackened their faces with mud. Then they crawled, inch by inch through the jungle, past Marine sentries who stared into darkness and saw nothing, under barbed wire, around defensive positions. Getting closer. Always closer. The first Marine to die never made a sound. A Japanese soldier rose from the darkness like a ghost, one thrust of the bayonet, then silence again. Then another Marine, and another. By the time the alarm went up, Japanese soldiers were already inside the American perimeter, fighting in the foxholes, hand-to-hand combat in pitch darkness where you couldn't tell friend from enemy. Marines fired blindly into the night, sometimes hitting their own men, sometimes hitting nothing at all. The Japanese kept coming, wave after wave, screaming, bayonets flashing in muzzle flare, officers waving swords, soldiers throwing themselves at Marine positions with no regard for their own lives. It wasn't just an attack, it was psychological warfare. The Japanese knew that terror was a weapon, that a Marine who couldn't sleep was a Marine who couldn't fight. That fear spread faster than any disease. So they made their night raids as horrifying as possible. They'd call out in English, "Marine, you die tonight. We know where you are. You'll never see sunrise." They'd throw rocks to make Marines waste ammunition firing at shadows. They'd infiltrate quietly, then suddenly scream and charge to create maximum chaos. They'd tie grenades to their bodies and throw themselves into foxholes. In the sounds, God, the sounds. Marines reported hearing Japanese soldiers laughing in the darkness, singing, chanting, making animal noises to disorient and terrify. One Marine on Guadalcanal wrote home, "I'd rather face 100 Japs in daylight than 10 in the dark. At least in daylight you can see death coming." But it got worse. The Japanese refined their tactics with each battle. By Tarawa, they'd perfected the art of night infiltration. They'd send scouts ahead, small teams that would slip through American lines and hide, wait, then attack from behind when the main assault began from the front. Marines would suddenly find themselves surrounded, fighting in all directions, never knowing where the next attack would come from. At Peleliu, Japanese soldiers hid in caves during the day, emerged at night like vampires. They knew every trail, every shadow, every approach. Marines didn't. They were fighting in unfamiliar terrain, in darkness so complete you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, against an enemy that had made the night their domain. The psychological toll was devastating. Marines stopped sleeping. They'd take turns on watch, but even off-duty men couldn't close their eyes. Every sound was a potential threat. Every shadow held death. Sleep deprivation made them paranoid, jumpy, dangerous to themselves and each other. There are documented cases of Marines shooting at their own sentries, of entire units opening fire because one nervous private thought he saw movement. The Japanese knew this, counted on it. They'd deliberately make small noises, snap a twig, rustle leaves, then disappear, wait for the Marines to exhaust themselves and their ammunition shooting at nothing. Then attack for real when the Americans were confused and depleted. It was brilliant, ruthless, effective. And it worked because the Japanese soldier had been trained differently than his American counterpart. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spirit over firepower, willpower over technology, the belief that a determined warrior could overcome any obstacle through sheer force of will. Night attacks embodied this philosophy. They required courage, discipline, absolute commitment. You had to be willing to die, expected to die, welcomed death if it meant taking Americans with you. This wasn't propaganda. This was genuine belief drilled into Japanese soldiers from their first day of training. They practiced night attacks endlessly, crawling through obstacle courses blindfolded, learning to fight in complete darkness, memorizing terrain by touch. American Marines had no equivalent training. They'd learned to shoot, to take cover, to advance under fire, but always in daylight, always with visibility. Nobody had prepared them for this. For an enemy that embraced the darkness, that turned night into their greatest advantage. The Marine Corps adapted, eventually. They developed new tactics, new protocols, new weapons specifically for night fighting. Illumination rounds that could turn night into day, trip flares around the perimeter, interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. They trained Marines to fight in darkness, to trust their hearing, to shoot at sound rather than sight. They established strict password systems. If you couldn't give the correct response, you got shot. No exceptions, no hesitation. They learned to sleep in shifts, to never let exhaustion compromise their alertness. But none of it eliminated the fear. Because the Japanese kept evolving too. At Iwo Jima, they abandoned the banzai charges. No more screaming attacks, no more wasted lives. Instead, they went silent. Small teams, surgical strikes, infiltrators who would slip into American lines, kill sentries without a sound, then disappear. Marines would wake up to find their buddy dead in the next foxhole, throat cut. No one had heard anything. That was almost worse than the charges. At least with a banzai attack, you knew they were coming. You could prepare, fight back. But silent infiltration, that was pure terror. You couldn't defend against an enemy you never saw, never heard, never knew was there until it was too late. Marines started sleeping with their hands on their weapons, bayonets fixed, grenades within reach. Some never really slept at all, just dozed, half awake, half dreaming, always listening. The Japanese understood something fundamental about warfare that Americans were only beginning to learn. That combat isn't just physical, it's mental, psychological, spiritual. Break a man's mind and his body follows. Night raids broke minds. They created a constant state of anxiety, of hypervigilance, of dread. Every sunset brought fear, every shadow held death, every sound could be your last warning. Marines became shells of themselves, hollow-eyed, shaking, unable to function. Combat fatigue, battle stress, what we now call PTSD. It was epidemic in the Pacific, and night raids were a primary cause. Medical officers reported Marines who couldn't stop trembling, who'd cry at the thought of another night in the foxhole, who'd rather face court-martial than spend one more night on the line. Some broke completely, catatonic, unresponsive, lost in their own minds. The Japanese had weaponized fear itself. And it worked. But here's what the Japanese didn't count on. Marines adapted, learned, overcame. They started their own night patrols, aggressive reconnaissance that pushed beyond the perimeter, that hunted Japanese infiltrators before they could attack. They established listening posts, small teams positioned ahead of the main line whose only job was to detect enemy movement and call in artillery. They used dogs, war dogs trained to smell Japanese soldiers, to alert before any human could detect a threat. They embraced technology, infrared scopes, sound detection equipment, anything that could give them an edge in darkness. And most importantly, they refused to be paralyzed by fear. Yes, night raids were terrifying. Yes, Marines died in the darkness. Yes, the psychological toll was immense. But they didn't break, didn't quit, didn't surrender to terror. They learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's functioning despite fear, fighting through fear, surviving fear. Every Marine who spent a night in a Pacific foxhole earned that knowledge the hard way. Through long hours of darkness, through false alarms and real attacks, through the death of friends and the near death of self. They learned that the human spirit is stronger than any tactic, any weapon, any terror. The Japanese night raids were devastating, effective, psychologically crushing. But they didn't win the war. Because ultimately the Marines who survived those nights became harder, tougher, more resilient. They'd faced their worst nightmare and lived. And once you've survived that, what else can break you? The veterans who came home from the Pacific carried those nights with them, some for the rest of their lives. They'd wake up decades later in cold sweats, heart racing, reaching for weapons that weren't there. They'd avoid darkness, need lights on, struggle with sounds in the night. The fear never completely left. But neither did the pride. Pride in having faced something unimaginable, in having survived when survival seemed impossible, in having stood their ground when every instinct screamed to run. Japanese night raids were designed to break the American fighting spirit. Instead, they forged it. Would you have survived that night? That's the question. Sitting in your foxhole, darkness pressing in, knowing they're out there, somewhere, coming for you. Could you have stayed calm, stayed alert, stayed alive? Most of us will never know. But we can honor those who did. The Marines who faced the darkness and didn't blink. Who turned terror into determination. Who proved that the human spirit, when tested, is unbreakable. They came at night. No lights, no sound, just bayonets and screams. And the Marines who survived became legends.